Hello, my name is Faisal Mahmood. I am a senior lecturer in counselling and psychotherapy at Newman University in Birmingham. I'm here with the senior leadership of BACP to discuss SCoPEd project. Welcome. Would you like to introduce yourself, who you are?
Okay, I'm Andrew Reeves. I'm chair of the board.
Fiona Ballantine, Dykes. I am Chief Professional Standards Officer and chair of the technical group of SCoPEd.
Hi, Fiona.
And I'm Hadyn Williams, I'm the Chief Executive.
Hi. So, I start. Members are angry. Members are quite emotional. They feel betrayed by the BACP and let down. What's the response?
Can I start? I think some members are angry. Some members feel that. I don't think it's accurate to say all members feel that. I think change is really difficult. And what we're trying to do here is slowly begin to introduce what might be seismic change over time. And from my perspective, the reason why we're doing that, we're doing things like the collaboration and SCoPEd, plus a whole range of other things, is because in the 5 years I've been chair, the most consistent communication I've had from people is that the status quo isn't working. That counsellors are having to work without pay, that employers don't know.
And I'm going to interrupt you there.
Go on.
That's exactly the argument that people are putting there, that this SCoPEd project will further create the status quo. The titles are fixed.
Okay, if I could just finish what I was saying then.
Sure.
So what I was saying was that the status quo isn't working. Okay, so what SCoPEd is intending to do at this stage, and I think this is where some misunderstanding has occurred, and I think we're responsible for that actually, is that SCoPEd has tried using a recognised methodology, and we can debate the methodology, I'm not a methodological expert, but has tried to look at what are the core standards, the core competence for counselling and psychotherapy across the board, and trying to understand where are we now? Who are we now? What do we do now? Because if I'm an employer and I want to employ a counsellor, frankly, I have no idea what a counsellor is, and it could be from a complete range of backgrounds. So it's much easier for me as an employer to employ somebody who maybe I don't have to pay. So I'm not claiming that SCoPEd is the answer to all of those problems, but for us to find the answer to those problems, we have to at least know where we are now. And I don't think before the work of SCoPEd, we even knew where we were. You could do a really good level 4 course or a really good level 7 course, or you could do the Andrew Reeves course above the barbershop at the corner, which had no credibility at all. And frankly, anybody can call themselves a counsellor or psychotherapist with a whole range of different types of training. We have fantastic members and fantastic training out there. What we're trying to do at this stage is at least capture who are they, what do they do, and how is training brought to that point?
Okay, thank you. I mean, I must clarify a couple of things that we have received a large number of questions, and my decision was not to read every single question out, but I picked up the themes. There are recurring themes, and people are asking similar kind of questions, and I might read some couple of questions because they are quite brief and kind of specific questions in relation to that. I want to step back from methodological debate about the SCoPEd project to what was the need of SCoPEd project? I understand to offer greater employability options for our counsellors, because out there employers, they're not very clear who should I recruit, are they properly trained, are they qualified to do this? But was there a feedback from the market or those stakeholders? Was there any research undertaken to highlight the gap in the market? Was there any commissioners saying that we don't really know who these people are? Because my understanding is that BACP is a known body, and UKCP and BPC, and people who come with a university or college or proper institute qualifications, that is usually taken quite seriously. I'm wondering about the gap, and what was the need of creating such a monstrous project? Fiona?
Well, I'd like to pick up on the point Andrew was making about describing who we are. I mean, we take it for granted that lots of people know what counsellors do, but we know from the evidence that often they're not given the credibility for what they do or the recognition for the level of skills they've had. And one of the things the mapping project has done, and don't forget we're at the research stage, as Andrew said, we're looking at what is at the moment, is that we've got captured the huge range of skills and knowledge that counsellors have even in column 1. And I say even because that's the heart of counselling, what's in column 1. It's way beyond tea and sympathy. It's way beyond just a listening ear. But out there's a perception that it's not much more than that. And this actually starts to capture that, but it also goes beyond that and says other trainings are also including other competencies and other levels. And that's what the mapping is about. It's trying to actually put that down in a way that we can look at it. It's not something we've created. It's something that we've captured. And I think that's a very important point.
But that message is lost.
Yes.
And what's your part in that? Because it doesn't appear like a research project, it doesn't appear like a mapping project. I know you have said this several times, Fiona, on different forums, but that's not how people see this. I mean, how many people, there's a couple of questions coming, that how you are perhaps unintentionally feeding into that status quo. You will create very set, rigid titles that 2 other bodies, they actually already agree to those titles. BACP always had a different stance about the difference between counselling and psychotherapy. The framework doesn't appear as a research project. So something got lost somewhere.
Yes, I think you're right. It did get lost somewhere. And I think the titles is probably one of the biggest problems we've got, because it suggests hierarchy and it suggests that they've been decided. And actually neither of those things are true. If we just put aside what you call those areas of competence for a minute, or what the person doing them is, then you start to have a more possible conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, with the benefit of hindsight, we took a leap there, and there are reasons for that which would take a long time to explain, which I think we're not at. And we've got to own that. That was not a good thing to do. But we've made it very, very clear that no decisions have been made about implementation, and that we've consulted at the first possible opportunity, which is to say we've done this work, we've used a methodology, we've used a particular way of it, and now we're saying this is what we found. And that could have far-reaching consequences, but none of that's been decided, including titles.
And the criticism, the gaps in your findings, even with your all right intentions, that there are lots of things not being captured. I mean, the classic example is, for example, that many counsellors or qualified counsellors, they regularly assess clients, and they're given those roles even in the employed work. The new project or framework, if it goes ahead in this form, will not allow qualified counsellors to undertake assessment.
I don't know if I've got something I can say on
Go
that,
for
but
it,
yeah.
yeah.
So that was strong feedback, and as you know, since the consultation, we have looked at every single line of feedback, the themes, the minute contributions to trying to improve the framework, and areas of research that we might have missed. And that is one area which there was a huge kickback on. So we've gone back to the evidence. We were at the ERG meeting yesterday, and that was one of the areas we were looking at, and that will almost certainly change because of the consultation, because of the feedback. Again, the methodology will show you, the document will show you how we got to that, but there may have been something we missed. That's what we're doing now. So that's just one example. There'll be others as well.
Can I come in as well? Because I wanted to respond what Fiona's saying. I mean, from my point of view, I wasn't involved in the research for this and all of this. So I saw SCoPEd for the first time when everybody else did. I didn't have a preview of it, and I totally agree with that criticism. Actually, I think we made a mistake by using titles. We weren't. I think if you look at the fine tuning of it, we weren't suggesting titles; they were descriptors. But that kind of language is lost in the consultation, and I understand why that is the case. I think actually, in hindsight, had we gone out to the memberships and the stakeholders and said something like, as a counsellor or as a psychotherapist, you gain competencies. You can gain those competencies through training, and you can gain competencies through experience, and you can gain competencies through CPD. What we've done is try to map all of those competencies. We've tried to capture them. No titles, no hierarchies, nothing like that. And we'd have said, these are the competencies that from the mapping we think we've got. Where are the gaps? Where are the mistakes? Where are the things that don't really reflect real world practice? I think we would have had a very different engagement, and that's our responsibility.
At the point of entry, though. I mean, that's
Yes.
a really important point. Because there's a lot of questions about what it means for people once they've qualified, once they've gained experience. And this consultation didn't seek to answer that, although that's a very, very important question.
Like to move on. Hadyn, I'd like to ask you, as a CEO, what's the BACP's position about counselling and psychotherapy? Are they two different things?
Is counselling and psychotherapy two different things? I think what SCoPE is doing is actually demonstrating there are different areas of experience which require different skill sets based upon those experiences. There are different clinical needs. What you call them is another matter.
Okay.
Whether you choose to call it a psychotherapist or a counsellor or something else is somehow immaterial. What we seem to be always hooked on is the status of title.
Can you see, Hadyn, that the SCoPE project, I mean, of course, the discussion is very much about that. I'll keep coming back to this. In the current formation of the hierarchical, the three columns, clearly distinguish counselling from psychotherapy. That's what we call as a research or mapping process, but that's what people see.
Well, I think what
causes
we're
a lot of
trying to make
anxiety for
really
people.
clear here is that with the benefit of hindsight, we wouldn't label with pre-existing labels. We would have looked differently around something which is given a perception of hierarchy, which is profoundly the opposite of what was intended. It was trying to differentiate what are the areas of practice and how do those then get represented in a consistent and articulate way that those who are not within our profession but who choose to employ us can understand, to give them confidence and enthusiasm. That is the driving motivation here. To try to splice the Gordian knot, if you like, of the things that have held us back as a profession, which is a superabundant sort of focus upon titles and hierarchy. We got caught in aspects of that ourselves, but the purpose is to smash that so we can represent in a truly inclusive way the dynamic aspects of all our remarkable membership. That is the driving force here, to ensure that our members are adequately represented as highly skilled individuals adding determined value into society, rather than being marginalised because they ain't understood.
That's lovely, Hadyn. But that's not the message coming through the SCoPE project. And I understand the hindsight, I understand the errors, but that's completely different narrative to explain the range of very complex skills the BACP's members they have, and they deliver, most of them, as you know, excellent work and extremely hard work. But that's not the message, the valuing their skill.
Well, I think it's important to say that we are recognised that it's created a fear and an anxiety. That's deeply regrettable.
Okay.
Deeply regrettable.
Can you scrap SCoPE project?
And retain the status quo.
Well, status quo's, yes, status quo's there. There are some training institutes, they clearly distinguish between psychotherapy and counselling training. There are bodies we know as UKCP, BPC and many other, they have absolute clear, so I completely agree the status quo exists. BACP has been the one force in the market that who didn't agree with that status quo in that way. So I agree with you, but I'm not really convinced the SCoPE project in its current form is really addressing the status quo, because the problem is, I have to tell you the question, and lots of people ask the same question, there's a lot of focus on entry point. I understand you need to start from somewhere, but what about the people with experience? What is the mechanism? And what's the research tells us that people moving from one strand to other, because the current system is that you cannot move from the counselling to psychotherapy, you cannot go.
You're making an assumption that we don't agree with you there.
Yes.
Yes, I am.
Yes, you're making an assumption, and a lot of the challenge here is based upon assumptions. One of the fascinating things about entering at such an early stage with a consultation is that on one hand we're demonstrating we want to listen and find out how does this become something that we can accept, but at the same time we're being challenged, where's the finished article? This is a process. Like any process, when you're with a client, you understand the client at the early stages in distress. You both have a sense of You need to get to a place where that distress is mitigated. But the beginning of the process, what that really looks like, who knows? You accept a process by mutual engagement. This, excuse the parallel, follows that same trajectory. We're at the beginning of a consultation discourse. We're already learning from the feedback. How do we work collaboratively within our own membership of almost 50,000 people to find the way that creates the most appropriately and universally acceptable way of describing our profession to those who want to employ us? How do we do it? This is a process we're going through. I can't give you the finished article, and that's the tension. People want a finished article, but without engagement and consultation, I can't give you the finished article.
I accept that. But can you give any reassurance to your members who are rightly quite anxious about the future in this profession?
Well,
because people are asking questions.
Yes,
what's
of course
going to happen? I mean, there's a question came that if somebody works in a private practice, they get clients, and will they be stopped? Will they not be insured? Because the label will be given that they're not entitled to undertake assessments. I know there's option to make some changes. But can you offer some reassurance?
Yes, of course.
Okay, and what's
an
the reassurance?
Abundance of reassurance. It would be completely counterintuitive of me and BACP as a whole to work in a way that undermined and disadvantaged our members. Why on earth would we do it? What matters is through this process is how we support. So, exactly what implementation looks like and exactly how we get there. I can't give you the chapter and verse of that yet because nothing's been formally agreed with the membership through a consultation. Nothing's formally agreed. But I would want to see a process by which you recognise someone's initial qualification falls in a particular territory. But that might be 10, 15 years ago. They're not stuck under this new framework, what was 10 or 15 years ago. What then is added to an understanding where they might sit in any future framework is dependent upon all their subsequent experience and skills, how they can represent themselves, the context in which they've worked, their ability to work with different and complex issues based upon that remarkable journey they've got. That gets represented and that gets mapped in subsequently as to where they might sit and represent themselves within a subsequent framework.
It's the exact opposite, in fact. It could be a very enabling framework to recognise people's journey over time. But we haven't even got the starting points yet. And, one of the paradoxes is that we're criticised for having made decisions. We're also criticised for not providing a finished article. And actually, you can't have it both ways. We tried to consult the moment we had something to ask about. And that asking about was that mapping process.
I'm going to come back to the question about counselling and psychotherapy question. So what is the current position of BACP about the distinction between counselling and psychotherapy?
At the moment, we say that in practice it's very difficult to tell because people move and journeys move, but we are saying that if you look at that amount of members, 60,000 members, there are differences in their training. Forget the titles for a minute. Most people would agree that there is a difference between doing a particular type of training, maybe a vocational level 4 diploma, which are of immense value and have never been represented properly before, and somebody who's done something at a different level, which has included a different range of competencies and perhaps higher academic skills and perhaps greater practice requirements and greater supervision requirements, all those things. It's part of a package. Most people agree there are differences, but our current setup means that we can't articulate those in every way, and that actually means everybody loses out. Mm-hmm. Because you can't, at the moment, if you join BACP, we say 1 year full-time, 2 years part-time, 100 hours. Now, if I'm just sitting in a workforce development meeting for the NHS and they say, well, why would we employ counsellors in this role? And I say, well, because they've done 1 year full-time, 2 years part-time and 100 hours client work. I have nothing else that I can use to say, actually, they have all these competencies, and we know because we've looked at the trainings, we've looked at what people do, and look, they can do all these things, and why aren't you employing them? And why aren't we making it more accessible to people? And why aren't we addressing the social justice issue, that it shouldn't be about people just in private practice who can afford it? It should be central, it should be at the heart of psychological therapy.
Can I
Sure,
just
please,
add a bit in there as well, because I kind of want to very quickly offer myself as a case study for that. But you know, my first counselling training was a level 4 training at the local college. It was a practitioner training, and exactly the sort of training that Fiona's just described. And in virtue of another role I had, I kind of worked as a counsellor without level 4 training. And lots of assumptions were made about me because of that. And I felt that training was a fantastic training. It's a training that I'm still incredibly proud of, and it equipped me with a whole range of skills. But there was no baseline from which I could argue that position. And I support what Fiona's saying also, that, you know, I've worked for many years in many different organisations, and I'm a counsellor. I define myself as a counsellor, and I'm very proud of that, because for me, counselling comes from a community orientated, a psychosocial position. And I've worked alongside psychotherapists. Now, to go back to your question, Faisal, how do we differentiate between counselling, psychotherapy and practice? It's almost impossible to do, because what I was doing as a counsellor was pretty much identical to what they were doing. I was working long term, I was doing assessments, I was doing all of that. But my training was different, and actually for me it was important that it was different, and it was important that I had that identity as counsellor, not least of which because we know you know, there are significant numbers of people who actually prefer to see a counsellor than a psychotherapist. But that doesn't mean to say that one is better than the other, that they sit alongside each other, but it is at the training point where are the biggest differences.
Yes, and how would you feel? You are a very experienced practitioner. You've written books. Teach counselling. When you write books, your title covers both counselling and psychotherapy. In that, how would you feel that if in 6 months' time, unintentionally, BACP become a partner in implementation of a SCoPEd project in somewhat similar kind of framework as it exists at the moment, that somebody just trained 6 months ago in psychotherapy, they're in a master's, they have given a higher status than you as a practitioner. That's the question that people are asking.
No.
And I understand the entry point a bit. I think that's absolutely clear. People are clear about that. And I understand that argument. But the concern is not the technicalities of the document. The concern is that how it will impact, or likely to impact. Because the documents offer some guidance and some, because the problem is that the requirements that sits under the psychotherapy column are not the requirements that I can imagine that people will easily be able to develop in their clinical practice, undertaking a master's qualification, for example, level 7, or undertaking a mental health placement, and or a research project, for example. So there are quite kind of serious hoops that people will have to cross. So,
So if we had a document in 6 months' time that prevented that kind of movement and development shift, I'd be hugely disappointed with it, and it would be a document that wasn't fit for purpose.
We wouldn't want to.
Well, but what I would also be disappointed by is the document hadn't shifted, and so. For me, this is my individual perspective. SCoPEd went out there. Now, if you ask me as an individual practitioner, do I agree with everything that's in SCoPEd? No, of course I don't. Absolutely do not. However, what it is a really good baseline from which we can have the discussion. And I totally get the pushback that we've had, and actually would have been disappointed that we had not had that, because what we need is the consultation. This isn't an empty consultation. This is putting out to the membership and saying what works, what doesn't work, how can it be improved, how can it be taken forward. So to go back to your question before, could we scrap SCoPEd? Yeah, of course we could. Anything can be scrapped. Would it be wise to do that? Personally, I think it would be foolhardy to do that, because it would throw the baby out with the bathwater. As opposed to, let's use the collective experience of our members, the people who've worked to develop this document, the people who are out there in practice, the people coming in, sending the questions, and let's say, where is this falling short? How can we build on this, change it, scrap bits of it, develop it, enhance it, so that in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months' time, actually it facilitates exactly what you're
outlining. Could there be any guarantee given by the leadership? You are the most senior people within the BACP, that you would not agree to a framework that will further lead up to status quo, the rigid boundaries between titles, because that's the position of other bodies in this partnership. They have an absolute clear distinction, and there isn't really any CPD route or any experience-based route to make a transition from one title to another, could you give any guarantee to your members that that's not what BACP would agree? Because that is the gist of it. That's the core of the argument. I think many practitioners understand, and they have developed, working for the last 20, 10, 15 years, and developed a range of different skills. And I think they need to hear your commitment that you're not going to be part of the further rigid status quo system.
Well, as Hadyn said, I mean, why would we do that to our own members? It's exactly the opposite. It's about wanting to help people go from where they first entered to another place if they choose to do so. Nobody has to do that. Nobody's going to make anybody do that. But let's just imagine that we had a framework which would enable, say, a course that just added some additional competencies, which would enable somebody to move to a different place. That's what we could imagine in the future if we could all agree it. But to have lots of separate people doing that with different meanings, which is actually what we have at the moment, it doesn't really provide any coherence. And we mustn't lose the fact that we're trying to work together and trying to come up with a common understanding around what practitioners in different groups can do, and let's not go back to the title issue, that is actually gaining huge credibility and traction out there, because that is not what we've managed to do in the past. And that's the sort of conversation that has an impact on stakeholders, because they do notice that we're trying to do something when I say professionalise, that has a negative connotation, but to represent our members as professionals in a way that is intelligible. In some ways, having that language is exactly about protecting what actually happens in the therapy room. But providing a language to talk about that to other people and to provide the opportunity.
Can I just very quickly as well, to add in as well, and you know, Hadyn and I were sat around the table right at the start of this collaboration with UKCP and BPC, and in a sense, the problem that I think you quite rightly outlined, Faisal, is how the organisations over many years have developed and operated in silos and in isolation, and that then has contributed to the situation we're in. I really can't emphasise enough just how critically important it is that this work, not the current document per se, but the development of this document, the consultation of this document, is actually being done in collaboration. I appreciate at the moment it's with 3 organisations, and that's because this has been a mammoth task, actually, to get 3 organisations sat around a table and working as well as we're working. And of course it needs to be broadened out, of course it does.
Is there any plan?
Yeah, of course it is. Yeah. I mean, I can't say by a week on Friday, but you know, this has gone out to all PSA holders. This has gone out to a whole range of members. We've collated all that feedback, and of course, you know, we will take things forward as a collaboration, but that has to be an inclusive one in different ways and different styles in the future. But actually, the fact that this is coming out of 3 organisations which are representing in the region of 65,000 members, who have almost literally fought each other over the decades, and that has held back counselling and psychotherapy in a way that virtually nothing else has, I think is fantastic. And I am aware that some of the people who take a position against SCoPEd, and I respect their position, also take a position against the collaboration. And you know, I've been a practitioner for 35 years, and it would be a very grim day, I think, if we tried to sabotage this early collaborative working. I know it's the 3 organisations, and there's good reasons for that, but this is a direction of travel, and I think we need to try and support ourselves in not judging how it stands now as to how it will therefore stand in the future. This is a developing process.
There is an argument that this is a psychodynamic coup SCoPEd project. Is it true?
No.
I mean, there's hardly any humanistic or person-centered presence or flavour or voice. There are many person-centered and humanistic practitioners who are very concerned and feel very strongly that they felt the BACP as their member body seriously betrayed and joined that narrative of de-skilled position of person-centered practitioners.
There was greater representation in the technical group, but that was one of the messages loud and clear from the consultation, that those groups felt disadvantaged and not heard and not included. And that's one of the reasons why we have widened out the ERG. We've put out an advert, and we're actually interviewing next week those people who've put in an application. And one of the things that we're specifically asking for those people joining is to address those issues, particularly the issues around language and issues around inclusivity. I mean, we did make various statements in the methodology about the language not being perfect, but again, it all got lost in translation, and actually a lot of those standards were what we found, but that doesn't mean that's the only way of expressing them. They need to be expressed in ways which are inclusive, and we haven't achieved that. We've failed.
Is it true, this is my personal opinion, that other bodies like BPC and UKCP, they had some quite, from the very onset of their development, they had a rather much more clarity around about the titles, about the skills and competencies they would expect different titles to achieve. And BACP always tried to kind of be more inclusive, and the complexity of the practitioners within BACP membership is much more greater than any other membership.
Indeed.
Is that then unintentionally the risk that BACP lost its shape and structure and a clarity, and unintentionally going with more rigid voices within the partnership? Because I can imagine, for example, BPC and for that reason UKCP are very clearly not negotiating terms like transference and counter-transference, for example. Am I making sense?
Yes, you're kind of addressing the language, but you're also addressing the issue of how BACP fits with two organisations that already have a rigid structure.
And the influence, as a largest body, much larger body than as compared to two other bodies. What influence are you putting of your presence and bringing the complexity to the profession instead of trying to fit in the rigidity as they always kind of advocated?
But what's kind of interesting, actually, I think what the mapping has done is to actually hugely raise the respect of BACP members with our collaboration partners around the fact that BACP members will fit in any of those categories and perhaps occupy many more places in the column 3, which currently labelled psychotherapy, than they had realised. And actually the common ground around the second entry point was an argument we fought to the death in 2012 during the attempt at statutory regulation, with those partners arguing that psychotherapeutic counsellors were better than BACP counsellors. That's not supported by the evidence, and that's an interesting finding from the mapping. Again, we haven't got to implementation or titles yet, but that is a significant finding.
Okay. If I'm a counsellor, 12 months' time, the SCoPEd project, more or less, in a similar form, is published as a framework of competencies in this profession. How are you going to help me as a BACP member? That is there any way I can demonstrate that I have enough expertise and skills, I've done enough training on my job, I've attended a range of CPDs? How are you going to support me to make that transition from one title to another title?
We have to be very careful here, because if I give you a straight answer, you'll tell me we've already worked out what's going to happen, and we haven't. But I can tell you that there was no way we wouldn't have mechanisms to recognise that.
Okay, that's very clear. Thank you. Moving on. I want to shift a discussion to on the other side. There's a question, and I'd like to read a question. I think it's very brief. There is a silent voice who supports SCoPEd project. What is your role in not supporting them? Do you have an intention to engage both sides of the argument?
To support both sides of which argument?
There's a silent voice out there
Sure.
who supports SCoPEd project within the BACP membership. They're very silent, they're very quiet.
Well, some are, some aren't.
I'm surprised with your answer, because Hadyn, I haven't seen much public support by membership within the BACP or SCoPEd project.
Well, certainly from within the sort of the social media world, maybe not. But
Yes, that's what I go with. Yes,
but we have 50,000 members, and they communicate with us in a multiplicity of ways,
Including through the consultation feedback. A lot of the comments in the consultation feedback were positive and supportive. They didn't they weren't blanket positive.
Yeah.
There were comments and criticisms, quite rightly.
Critical friends.
Critical friends, exactly. We
But the
also
question is that perhaps you're not offering enough support to those members and that side of the voice. Is there anything BACP can do more? Because that voice is not that loud out there.
Part of what we're doing now, right now, is supporting that voice. If we're talking about supporting the voice that's pro-scoped, if that's what you're referring to.
You're not thinking that I'm a pro-scope person.
No.
no, that's not what
I wouldn't dare to assume.
No.
You're neutral at the moment. At
Well, I'm
very
not.
least.
I'm very critical of scope
Yes,
projects.
okay. But it's the critical friend voice, which is what consultation is about. There's been a lot of fear around, sort of people are afraid to voice their opinions because they might be attacked for voicing their opinions, or that, which is a common phenomenon in many sort of social media forums, not just BACP forums, but across the globe, in terms of how a populist voice can be quite intimidating at times. But part of what we're doing now is an attempt to try and bring to address the fear that we recognise underpins a lot of the attack, because the fear is about some of our failings to communicate effectively. And by trying to communicate actually from a genuine and congruent place what the outcome intended landscape that we want to inhabit, and scoped is merely a vehicle by which we might inhabit that. That's what we're trying to achieve by these types of conversations and subsequent conversations. Because to lose the opportunity, as Andrew implied, to lose the opportunity of getting to that landscape, which I know from the days before I became chief executive, I've been a therapist for umpteen years myself, of the constant challenge that why aren't we being an articulate, non-vociferous profession that is able to represent itself in a really articulate way to commissioners and employers and society as a whole? What's BACP's role in making sure that happens? This is part of the strategy to address that, to bring some clarity and consistency, to bring a cohesion, to stop the splitting of voices. Because if we don't, the profession will continue to experience a decline and a marginalising, and other voices will step in and take the roles, which I see as absolutely counterproductive to what counselling can bring to society as a profound change agent. This is to ensure the success of counselling as that change agent as part of our commitment to social justice.
And we stand by the integrity of the consultation. I mean, if I understand the question correctly, it's about how do we support the people who hold a pro-scoped position, as well as the people who are anti-scoped. And I think it's the integrity of the consultation. It's about saying, well, this is the work we've done. This is where we're up to with it. There it is, what do you think? And as Fiona says, we obviously have had a lot of criticism from it, and it's about, and as I've said before, some of that I agree with. I'm a humanistic counsellor, I'm not a psychodynamic counsellor. I think the language is too medicalised. I'm not a medical model practitioner, that's not who I am or have ever been. So my feedback has been, I don't like the language of it, I don't like the structure of it, I don't like this, I don't like that. So it's to hear the criticism, but also to take on board. I received an email this morning from somebody who I know has emailed you, and who has said, I don't know if you've asked that question because I don't know what that question was, but has basically said, actually I am pro-scoped, and I hope you have an opportunity to say that there are people out there who strongly agree with this. Well, their voice is as important, but it is a silent one. So by trying to communicate, it's really hard to communicate with such a broad audience, but trying all sorts of different ways to communicate, to encourage people to talk. It has become a difficult area for people to say, I agree with scoped, without being kind of heavily criticised. But the integrity of the consultation is about hearing all the voices, all of them.
I feel very concerned about the toxic environment created in the field. I mean, the social media is full of that. I worry as a professional that that I wonder that what's the impact on potential clients when they read those messages, the level of toxic comments. And I also worry at times that the very professionals who are supposed to stand against oppression, unintentionally perhaps, became a part of an oppressive force. And I read your comments about and your piece, Andy. Hey, how are you? And I would like to hear from all three of you that how are we going to survive? How are you going to survive as a BACP and larger BACP membership? Because I think it's a kind of a mini Brexit situation for BACP and BACP membership, the SCoPEd project.
Can I start?
Please.
Because this might be a therapeutic rant, okay? And I've written the piece in Therapy Today. Some people take a position that becomes toxic completely inadvertently. They have no intention of doing that. Some of the messages I've received: you're a worthless human being, you stink of rotting fish. That's not unintentional. And they're from members. It's abusive and it's unacceptable. And I totally support what you say. This isn't a BACP problem. This isn't a counselling and psychotherapy problem. We're seeing this played out in social media worldwide. I mean, there are very current examples of how people are being attacked on social media. What disappoints me the most is that counsellors and psychotherapists who have undertaken a training and should be reflective practitioners, should embody the ethical framework or whatever ethical framework they subscribe to, should hold a sense of decency and respect for other people. I have absolutely no problem, genuinely I have no problem in people writing to me and saying, I hate SCoPEd, I don't like this, because that's what the consultation is for. When I stood as chair of BACP because I really disliked a direction of travel for BACP, so that was a decision I made for myself. I do object to disagreeing voices being shouted down, being humiliated, whether it's a pro position or anti position, and I would put a call out by disagree, challenge, hate what we're doing. But we have to bring a bit of respect in, because what worries me is those people who write those abusive things on social media. I'm all right, thank you for asking. I'm well supported. But you know, I do worry about people who are able to do that on social media, then walking into a room with a client. What's going to happen to that client if the client disagrees with them? You know, that worries me. So disagreement, great. That's what has propelled this organisation forward over 40 years. But abuse, no room for it. I have no tolerance for it at all.
Do you have any comments?
I think it's, as Hadyn alluded earlier, this isn't a challenge unique to BACP, and you know, I think Andrew's column evoked a big response because we recognise something profoundly disturbing about our own members behaving like that. But BACP has a difficult task around how to respond to that without being heavy-handed or imposing rules. What we have a responsibility to is ask the question, which is, what do we do about this? As a community of practitioners, and I'm a practitioner too, and I feel very vulnerable in this SCoPEd project at some of the things that have come my way. It's not an easy place to be, but the sort of the knee-jerk reaction to just kind of close things down or take hard-line decisions around members would probably be counterproductive. I think we want to ask the membership, what's an appropriate response in this regard? What should we be doing as an organisation to try and address this kind of thing?
I want to move discussion to a slightly different direction. I think Andrew did touch this in the very first response, but I would like to revisit that. My experiences, and I worked in industry in service delivery, managing services, worked alongside commissioners and public health sectors, and of course now work at university. Counselling as a profession is not taken seriously. Even some people would argue, other stakeholders, that this is even a profession.
Yeah.
There is a perception, there's a history of counselling emerging as a support, as something people do on a voluntary basis, and to some extent I think counselling as a profession hasn't been able to manage to appear as a serious profession or serious professionals. I work alongside many NHS and commissioners, and I remember at one point a few years ago a commissioner asking me that bring me something that's credible, and I will put in my contract, and I will that only counsellors can deliver something like this. So your organisation will have to recruit counsellors. And of course I didn't have anything to bring. BACP's been around for many years. We're making some changes now. What's BACP's role in creating this almost semi-professional image of counsellors or the profession, which is not taken seriously by other stakeholders? We all know the mental and emotional health is a huge issue, and there is enough funding. The funding is given to other professionals. There are a range of mental health professionals and IAP professionals, psychologists and many other people. Counselling doesn't really fit in. It just try to kind of creep in here and there in some regions, but that's pretty much what we have managed to capture. The landscape is huge. It is quite embarrassing that we haven't been able, or you haven't been able to take this profession to the level where I think our sister organisations.
This, of course, is what SCoPEd wants to address.
This is what we're trying to do.
This is part of the agenda for SCoPEd, is to address those very issues. The history and BACP's involvement in that. My own personal involvement, I could probably articulate, and my experience of BACP's history, but what we recognise is the need for it to change because of the disadvantage to so many dedicated therapists who have so much to offer to society, that unless we can represent that we can demonstrate, as incidentally, with all its current faults, SCoPEd does demonstrate within that first column that counselling is an immensely sophisticated and complex intervention that sits, for the very first time can be demonstrated, sits at the very heart of psychological therapies. Counselling sits at the heart of psychological therapies and can be represented in a way that is understood as a coherent, rational body of people that have value to society and are employable. That is its purpose.
And actually, just to add, one of the problems we've had is because it sits in a space where lots of people occupy bits of what we do, it's very difficult to identify exactly what our members do. We all know there are trainings out there that aren't worth the paper they're written on, that are gift certificates with online day courses calling themselves all sorts of what. This project also helps us to distinguish 65,000 members and all the others who would want to be seen in that group from that kind of thing developing, and that's what's also been to the detriment of our profession, the fact that it includes all that stuff as well. And I don't think anybody would disagree that there's some really dodgy stuff out there that would simply not map anywhere onto any sort of framework that had practice standards, minimum teaching standards, and competencies attached to that.
Sorry,
please, yes.
Just one other thing as well, because I agree with what both Hadyn and Fiona have said, but I also disagree with the premise of your question, because as I understood it, the question was kind of assuming that we haven't moved forward very far in those years, and that's absolutely not my experience. You know, when I was first training, I applied to a doctor's surgery to do a counsellor placement, and I was almost laughed at as if I was suggesting something indecent. The whole notion of a counsellor working in that setting just wasn't in people's thinking at all. And I think people who are coming into the profession latterly, and understandably, take for granted the position we're in. It didn't exist. People didn't talk about counselling. So you see, so the biggest cohort of people, I think, that has been the most significant change is probably the most important cohort of people, and that's the general public, who now use counselling as a reference point for positive psychological help at a time of emotional difficulties. They just use the language. You know, it's embedded in public parlance, and that is a cultural shift that is huge. We have counsellors, and I know these are problematic areas, I'm not being naive here, but we have counsellors in IAP, we have counsellors in universities, we have counsellors in colleges, we have counsellors in schools, we have counsellors in the third sector, and of course we have counsellors in private practice. We have counsellors in all sorts of workplaces. 20, 30 years ago, that just did not happen. So I reject the premise that very little has shifted in that time. However, I think a huge amount has shifted at that time, but we're now at a critical next stage iteration of our development. And as difficult as it is, and it's always difficult, I've had several ex-chairs contacting me of BACP saying whenever there's been a point of critical change, it's always been a difficult process. But I'm not complacent about it. So I think SCoPEd at the moment is an imperfect attempt, but is a first stage attempt in trying to say, let's take this 30, 40 years of very real development and we have to shift it into the next frame. Because as Fiona says, there are services being closed and replaced by wellbeing workers. I'm not against wellbeing, but wellbeing workers is a different iteration to counsellors completely. We know this. We have nothing to hold on to. Very, very quickly. When, I'm a social worker, and I've used this analogy before. Everyone hated social workers when I first qualified. I can see why. we were the bottom of the pile, but we had two things going for us that nobody could take away. We had child protection legislation and we had mental health legislation. So whether you liked us or not, you had to have us. And social work sorted itself out. It sorted out its training standards, its competency, a standard level of training. It moved in a different direction, and now actually social work, I think, is held in reasonably good esteem, certainly by comparison. Counsellors don't have that. We have all of these other professionals who, as Fiona says, do bits of what we do. And what SCoPEd and its future developments hopefully is intended to achieve is that equivalence that other professions have achieved that we now need to grapple with. Otherwise we will disappear.
I mean, I wonder that if BACP will face this crossroad T-junction situation, that the competing needs. For example, there are some members of BACP or larger in this profession who disagree fundamentally to work in partnership with anything that links with health or mental health. If you start from that point, there's no way in 100 years that BACP can ever support or take the profession forward of counselling, where in 20 years' time the main workforce within IAPT are the BACP's members. Because if you don't want to work alongside those partnerships, whereas some other people who are kind of very engaging and that might be a dilemma that BACP will have to face to choose.
That it either belongs in a medical context or not.
Yes.
Well, I don't think so, because again, I think that if we were able to arrive at a framework that had a meaning, then it has potential way beyond the NHS. I mean, it would be possible to start talking about community counselling practices, which was supported by other streams of funding, which weren't subject to the kinds of strictures that you get in an NHS context. But again, I mean, that's a stage ahead. At the moment, if that happens, it's very often voluntary, it's very often has no particular, it's very much a localised achievement rather than a national achievement. But we could have those conversations with policymakers if we had something that we could articulate in the way that we simply can't at the moment.
And you say it's a T-junction. Oh, I wish it was a T-junction. It's spaghetti junction. It's multifaceted. There's roads going in all sorts of different directions. And you're right. There are people who are completely opposed to any counselling that is linked with what is perceived to be a medical model. And I respect that. I respect their position on that. It's not my position. I'm not a medical counsellor, and I don't subscribe to a medical model of mental health. But I've worked alongside those settings. I've worked in sexual mental health, and in fact, actually, I've seen my position as a counsellor in those settings as being an alternative to people who are accessing those services. But people don't want to work in those, and then that's absolutely fine. It's about creating an environment where counselling is valued and recognised in a multi-layered different types of services, and people access what we do in a third sector, or some people will choose to go to private practice, or some people will go because they're at university or college, or some people will access it at school, and some people will access it through iApt or versions of that. But I think to say one or the other, exactly.
So that's a very non-medical setting, and it's becoming much more usual that, I mean, we have it here at BACP. We have access to counselling in terms of our own support. That wasn't there.
I want to move on. I personally, my own experience hearing about SCoPE project, as everybody else did, had a slightly very different perception than when I heard, especially when hearing what you're talking about, the intention and development. And do you have any control system in place that if you feel as BACP leadership, the SCoPE project is not heading in the direction and in the manner that you wish to support your members to be considered as serious professionals, would you stop? What I'm thinking about, your intention is absolutely clear. But if you realise in 6 months' time or 12 months' time, this is not the direction that you intended to go in, would there be any system to stop at that point? Because your intention is quite clear. I completely agree, and I don't think there will be any single member.
There will be practical.
There will be any single BACP member who heard your comments, Hadyn, and would disagree with that, regardless of their pro or anti SCoPE argument. And I think people are really, the people who are against SCoPE, they really think that you are losing that ground. Hearing that is brilliant. But what reassurance do you offer to your members that you will stop if the final structure or the framework is nowhere near?
I think it's perfectly clear that consultation, this isn't the consultation, this is a beginning of a consultative process and a continuing process of feeding back and refinement. If in 12 months' time it's abundantly clear that as configured at that stage, it ain't going to achieve or stand any chance of achieving the outcome of getting 65,000 therapists to this landscape of credibility in which they can represent themselves in an articulate way to employers in all contexts. If it shows it's going to be counterproductive to achieving that, then there's no way we're going to launch it. It could be a completely reckless thing to do, because the outcome is the most important thing of where we want to go. It's one of the vehicles of getting us to that place.
Can I add from the board perspective, because the board perspective is really critical here. So the board sets the strategy for the organisation. The board ultimately holds accountability for the work of BACP. SCoPEd and the collaboration is coming to the board at every single board meeting. The board is a small but very diverse group of people that represent the majority of whom are elected members of the association. They work as therapists, they're out there doing the work, they come from a range of modalities, but I would say a fair number of them are humanistic, person-centred. Every single board meeting, SCoPEd comes to it, the collaboration comes to it, and we have, I think, both Fiona and Hadyn would agree with me that we have very critical, challenging discussions about it. I can absolutely give you 100% guarantee that if the board did not feel that this was heading in a direction that could be evolved and developed to meet the needs of the members and thus our clients, they won't sign it off.
That's very helpful. Any technical response, Fiona?
Yeah, the technical response is that the project is designed in phases, and that changes all the time. So we've already agreed to put in a longer consultation period because of the reactions we've had on the first consultation. But at each point there's a gateway that needs to be signed off, and that has to go through all the strictures you would expect of a project, including approval by the board. So it's actually not some point in the future where we say by then we will have this and we will do that. It's quite the reverse. It's a series of stages.
I worry about that comment, Fiona, because I think the analogy I made early on about the Brexit, people are bored, regardless of anti or pro-Brexit, people are bored, and it has a massive impact on our society.
Yeah.
There is a risk that SCoPE could do something similar. People are bored, people are tired, it's more divisive, people so the longer it will go in its current form, the more people will feel frustrated and emotionally unhappy about the whole situation. So is there any vision that what's the maximum limit that you want to move the project to the next phase? Is there end point? Is there any thinking between the partners?
Well, I mean, there will be a framework at the end of the project.
Okay.
What we choose to do with that, in terms of implementation or non-implementation, that's a different set of questions. So there will definitely be a framework. That's the end point of the project.
Sure. Any thoughts when?
I can tell you what's written on the paper, but it doesn't mean that will be it.
Okay. What's written on the paper? I don't know what's written on the paper.
Well, we're hoping to have the second iteration out in October, which is
this year,
which is taking on board the feedback received in the last consultation and all the technical feedback and other sources of evidence and the new members of the ERG. And then there will be a further phase of consultation, and we'll see what people respond to that. In the meantime, we hope to have a much clearer narrative around what this is about, what we're trying to achieve, which obviously is something that still needs much clearer communication.
The SCoPEd is merely a vehicle by which we want to get to this other landscape that is so much more advantageous to 65,000 members, and as far as BACP is concerned, to its 50,000 members.
Okay. I want to stop this panel discussion. Any last few words that each one of you want to say to your members?
I think for me, I want to say that I'm chief executive of a very large membership body, and it's the membership that makes BACP. My duty, as of course is the board's, is to ensure that we represent to the very best of our abilities the interests of every single member. We're also a professional body, and we know that members really value the fact that we hold professional standards. It's one of the key ingredients why anyone would want to be part of us. Within the field of professional standards is required leadership. So one has to lead as well as to listen. And it is a careful fusion of those two things that will enable us to be the finest professional body in service of its members. That is my motivation.
It's hard to add something after Hadyn's just said all of that. But I suppose I would say, I'm a counsellor first. I'm a very proud counsellor. I'm delighted to be a counsellor. I would never do anything different. And as I said before, we had a board of governors at BACP that is just a fabulous group of people who bring the same passion from a diverse perspective and diverse communities and diverse kind of professional experiences. I have absolutely total confidence that the board will continue to scrutinise in detail everything that comes through to them, and will demand that things come through to them, and will ensure to the best of their ability that the direction that they take this association, which would also include any future collaborations of course, is the best for our members, and I think equally importantly, perhaps more importantly, the best of the people who walk through the door of the services of our members. And that for me trumps everything else.
Indeed.
Everything else.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Faisal.
Thank you.